All right, well, thanks everyone for joining. This is the Amherst Security Group on June 20th, 2024. We have Richard Brooks, who's going to be, or Dick Brooks, is going to be speaking to us tonight, and really appreciate him joining. So I turn it over to you, Dick. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. And I just want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I know that I'm sure you'd rather be home, enjoying your recliner or whatever it is you do to be restful after work. So thanks for coming out. Can you hear me okay through the Zoom? Yep, good. Okay. Okay, so I'll get started. I'll just give you a little bit of background. So as Robert said, my name is Dick Brooks, and I'm a co-founder of what used to be called REA. We now have a new name called Business Cyber Guardian. And we did that because too many people confused us. They thought that we only worked in the energy industry. And although I do a lot of work with the energy industry, it's not our only clientele. So I took an early retirement in 2018 from a company called ISO New England, which if you're not familiar with them, they're the ones that run the high-powered electric grid here across New England. I was the enterprise architect there and did a lot of work setting up their data analytics environments and BI, and also served as a software architect for their forward capacity market clearing engine. So it's true that I do a lot of work in the energy industry, but mostly what I do now is cybersecurity related, and I do a lot of work with the Department of Homeland Security, CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. And so what I'm going to show you here today, this presentation is one that I actually delivered to NASA and the Department of Energy at their request. They wanted to understand what a small software publisher or producer would have to go through in order to satisfy the secure by design software assurance requirements. So I'll give you just a moment of background on that. So the US government has announced that they are only going to purchase software that is secure by design. And that process began on June 8th. There's a software attestation form that software companies and other manufacturers will need to submit to CISA in order to qualify to sell product to the US government. And so what this presentation does is it shows what the process is to go through for a software vendor or manufacturer, anyone that wants to sell to the government. This is the process they would go through in order to submit their attestation materials. So let's go ahead. Bob, is it Bob or Robert? Robert. Okay, Robert, next slide, please. Okay, next slide. I've already done this. The only thing I didn't mention is that I work with two of the sector risk management agencies. One is the critical manufacturing sector, and the other is the healthcare sector. And these are the organizations that have been given responsibility for implementing these secure by design programs across the government. Okay. And that's a link you can go. Can you send the slides out, Raul, or just put the link out? They can just go to that and see. It's now what does BCG do, because that's our new name. Next slide. So we are the developers of software tools, and we also operate a trust registry. So our software tool is called Software Assurance Guardian Point Man. And what that is, it's an implementation to automate the risk assessment that's defined within the NIST standard SP 800-161. I'm going to bore the heck out of you guys tonight with all these crazy numbers, but you know how our business is. That's security, right? So NIST has this supply chain risk management standard that has been at the heart of many of the work efforts to secure the software supply chain, which the US government is now pursuing vigorously. But we also operate a trust registry. We work with the Internet Engineering Task Force on something called the Supply Chain Integrity, Transparency, and Trust Work Group. And what that group is trying to do is create this trust registry capability. So, you could think of this thing as sort of like it's like a consumer's report online. Let's say right now you went to, you had your iPhone, you went to the Apple store and you wanted to say, okay, I'm going to search for an app. And you'd like to, and you do your search and you get like 10 apps back. How do you know which ones are trustworthy? You don't. And so what you really need to have is the ability to do a little sort of a check, if you will, to say, is this thing trustworthy? So what a trust registry does is it basically records information from a credible party. They have to be credible, that has done a risk assessment on the product and calculated a trust score. And so that information goes into the trust registry. And I'm going to show you that, and I'll show you a link to one of the examples of the cybersecurity trust labels. But these cybersecurity trust labels are starting to, find a home. The U.S. is, the FCC is operating the U.S. Cyber Trust Mark. The EU has something called the CE mark, but basically it's the concept that I just described, that someone has looked at a product and said, that's trustworthy. And they put that entry where someone can look it up and see information about the trust declarations. Okay. So risk assessment, trust registry, place for people to go look. And you think about the score that I mentioned, it's a trust score. It's kind of like a FICO score. You know how the FICO score is a level of trustworthiness for debtors, It's the same concept, but for software. Next. Okay, so CISA has created this secure software attestation form. It's been a long time coming because it is highly political. Lots of people were trying to cut it back, and ultimately they ended up on 4 specific requirements that they said no compromise on. And it's basically that the software vendor must be able to say that they have built their products in a secure environment. And that means having individual separate environments for build and test and so on and so forth. And then they have to have essentially some degree of trust in the components that they're putting in the software. So much of what we do now is built on open source software, right? You don't really write a lot of bespoke software anymore. A lot of it's assembled and you glue it together. And so that's one of the other requirements, is that this vendor has to be able to show that they're using trusted software. The third requirement is that that they have some level of control over the provenance. Now, this is not a simple task, right? Provenance is not an easy thing. Like, where did the software come from that you're running on your phone? You download an app. Well, who created it? Is that from China? Is it from North Korea? Where's it from? You don't know. So provenance is one of the other critical points that they require. And the fourth main requirement is that you actually conduct and operate a coordinated vulnerability disclosure program. So the concept there is that you're a software vendor and you need to be able to enable and allow people, mostly researchers, to submit findings of vulnerabilities. A lot of these are bug bounty programs you hear about. Many of them are bug bounty programs, but not all. Some of them, are just the people out there who are just having fun trying to find holes, and they'll report it, and they won't report it to the vendor. They'll just put it out on some, dark website that they have this vulnerability, and they release an exploit, and voila, someone's in business extorting money. So this program requires that they operate a vulnerability disclosure program that receives those reports. But more importantly, and this is really the key for what we look at, is that the vendors are required to show that they're actually doing vulnerability assessments of their products before they ship it. So what this means is, and this is what CISA Director Easterly refers to as radical transparency, this refers to a program where a software consumer can go check and see what are the vulnerabilities, and show me the attestation that you have checked for vulnerabilities in this product before I buy it. And then, oh, by the way, I want you to make sure you're keeping up with that, because, you know, software is like mayonnaise, it goes bad, right? So, you know, or it can, and it can go bad quickly because a vulnerability can arrive in a moment's notice. So it's important that this process be ongoing, and it's important that the vendors be able to provide their consumers with that information upon request. This is not something that is just out of the box today in many vendors. They don't do it. So the concept in that fourth requirement is that the vendor will, A, produce that information showing vulnerabilities, and B, that they will have ongoing capabilities to show the status of those vulnerabilities in those products upon request. Okay, so at this point, I've hit you guys with a good bit of stuff already. Any questions about what the CISA program's about, the Secure by Design, or the attestation form? Or what's expected from vendors? We're all on the same page. Okay, great. So let's move over to the next. This is a program that's actually been going on for 2 years within CISA. They have a public-private partnership effort called the ICT, Information and Communications Technology, Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force. And it brings in people from literally all over the world, from industry and government, to collaboratively work on building solutions, basically, or documentation or guidelines to help parties implement best practices for cybersecurity. That's what they do. And specifically is for the software supply chain. So we have a program for small and medium businesses, which I worked on that one. And we have a program for software assurance, and that's the other one I worked on. And that's what this guide is. This buyer's guide is effectively the details of all the things that a vendor should be prepared to do in order to pass the US government risk assessment that's a part of that attestation process, right? So I tell people that really what the buyer's guide is, so the attestation form is only 4 things, right? But it doesn't go into any detail. It's just very high level, right? The buyer's guide fills in the gaps and says, this is what the US government's really going to be looking at in order to determine if your product passes the Secure by Design test. Okay, so that buyer's guide was announced just last Wednesday at a conference in McLean, Virginia, June 12th. Director Easterly announced that the buyer's guide is going through the approval process. OMB is reviewing it right now. CISA has already approved it. And so the Office of Management and Budget is going to give the final say on whether or not to release it. But it's certainly, it's finished. It's just a matter of getting the final approval from OMB, and then it's going to be released. So it should be sometime this month. Okay. Next. So I'm going to tell you about this repository that CISA operates, where vendors are expected to submit their attestation forms. So that link right there is the link to this user's guide for that repository. So if you want to understand what you need to do to submit your attestations and other artifacts like SBOMs and POAMs, which are basically operate documents on, I forget exactly what it is, but they're basically it's a plan of operations and maintenance or something like that. It's a government document that says, I'm deficient in this area, and here are the things I have to do, and they call that a POAM. So you submit that along with the document. Next. Now, normally, when I did this with NASA and DOE, I actually walked through this so they could see the actual experience that the vendor goes through. So you're not going to get that here, but you do have to log into the site, and it has MFA. So you have to get an authenticator. I use Google Authenticator for mine. You log into the site. Next. Now, getting an account on that site can take a little while. Sometimes it takes a couple of days to get one. So it's not a slam dunk. It's not like getting an email, a Gmail account, right? They do some research and send and approve you. So the first thing you would do once you get in there is you would create a software record. And that's what this screen is showing you. Here's my one of my submissions from a while back on the SAG PM software. So I created an entry in the portal for this software product. Next. And then what you'll see is when you look at the details of that record after you've created it, you'll find that there's an agency status below. So when you go to this portal and you submit your materials, they give you the option of identifying the different agencies that you can send this to. Because every agency ultimately has to do this work. They're required under the government regulations to do this risk assessment, approve the products before they can actually be purchased and used. So when you go into this portal and you upload your attestation, you get to assign the information, or you get to assign it to the agencies that you would like to have consider your software. Next. And so what you're seeing here is, okay, so here, the first one you see that entry there is the attestation itself. This is the CISA form. It's about 11 pages, and it has the 4 requirements, and you have to sign in blood that you really are doing all those things that you say you're doing. And so you then submit that, and that becomes the basis for starting the risk assessment on your product. You also, if you need to submit a POAM. There it is right there, Plan of Action and Milestones. That's what it is. I forgot the acronym. But anyway, if you need to, in other words, if you can't attest to all those requirements, those 4 requirements, then you need to submit a POAM. And you need to explain where your deficiencies are, okay? So at least those 2 documents. Only the first one is required, right? If you want to submit this, you do have to submit the POAM if you need to. So it's one of those cases where if you have a perfectly clean program and you are meeting all the requirements, the 4 requirements, no need for a POAM. Otherwise, get your POAM out. Any questions or anything on the line?
I have a question.
Yes, Jesse.
How does it relate to things like firmware? Is that, so like if you have kind of, I guess, embedded software on a device essentially, how does that really fall into these categories? Essentially, would they still be kind of same regulations or?
Yep, firmware is covered.
Okay.
Firmware is covered. Any software that the government uses that it's going to be sold to the government, if it's in a product.
Yeah, okay.
Or if it's an application on an app store or whatever it may be, those are all subject to this requirement.
Okay, interesting.
Yep.
That apply to new purchases or existing contracts?
I'm sorry, would you say that
Does
again?
that apply to existing contracts or only new purchases?
It depends on the agencies. Some agencies are requiring companies and vendors to submit them for all products. The State Department just issued their own requirements that said, we want you to submit it for everything. So the agencies really decide what they're going to do with these. The agencies have a lot of flexibility in what they do with this program. They'd have to meet the minimum, right? They have to get the attestations and they have to go through the process, but they pretty much have free rein to do what they want. They can ask for information that isn't listed in the regulation because they need it in order to complete their own risk assessments.
So is this particular portal just for getting through that process, or is it also where you would go to do lookups to see where vendors are, which vendors have been approved or?
You cannot see that. That's behind the curtain. That's only the government agencies can see that information. As a vendor, I don't know who else is out. We ships in the night here. I have no idea who else is here. Now, you can sort of find out, but I'm not going to go into that. Next slide. So one of the things, you remember I mentioned, that you're going through this process and different agencies are doing these risk assessments. One of the suggestions that we've talked about, and it's not in stone yet, but it's just something that's been talked about, is having a trust registry available. So let's say the Department of Energy says, hey, this Microsoft Word stuff, it's good. I checked it. It's good. Wouldn't it be great if you could just let the other departments know that? And other agencies know that? Because, they're gonna want to, they don't want to have to go through all the effort as well. And if someone else has already done it, well, why not take advantage of the fact that this guy and that guy said, yep, it's good. Well, why should I have to do a whole assessment myself as well? So the concept there is that you would put this information into the trust registry saying, yep, I checked it, it's good to go. And so here is where you would actually, look for information about what products or cybersecurity labels, if you will, have been approved. And it's by different parties. You can get a label from Department of Energy. You can get a label from NATO. There's some in NATO stuff in there. There's stuff from Germany. So the registry is really all inclusive. It's there to tell you someone has done a risk assessment on a product, and this was their finding, and they have registered it here because they trust it. If they didn't trust it, it wouldn't be here. It's when I talk to people, I explain, it's kind of like a registry of deeds, right? When you go look up a deed in a land records database, you don't question if it's authentic, right? I mean, you assume that you go to the state registrar of deeds and you get the material. You don't have to do the research and say, is this really a legitimate deed, right? I mean, does he really own an acre? You don't do that because the work has already been done. Someone has vetted this information through some process and then placed it into the registry of deeds. Same concept here. I don't know if you can click on that link. That would show you what it looks like. I don't know, the last link, Robert, are you able to click on that?
This one?
Yeah, that one. Click on that one.
See if I can.
It looks like you can.
Let's go.
Yeah, okay.
It went somewhere, but not, yeah, it just gave oh, maybe that's what you're looking for. Looks like that.
Oh, yeah, you're not, see, you know what? Okay, yeah. Can you do me a favor? Go up on that address line. I'm gonna tell you what to put on at the very end. Put an, at the very end, yeah, put an ampersand.
Okay.
Ampersand HTML equals 1. Equal 1. And then hit enter. Okay. So this is a little easier to digest. But basically what you're seeing is it's showing you the results of the risk assessment. So there's the score, there's the information about the product, there's the information that was submitted by the vendor. So that's that document right there, that additional info is where you would find information like, where's the SBOM for this thing? And where's the vulnerability disclosure report for this thing? So that has all the information that the government entities need to have available to do their risk assessment. And if you can just go scrolling on down here, I don't know why it's unspecified. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I know why. That's old. That's an old link. Yeah. Okay. Normally that VDR URL would point to the actual vulnerability disclosure report, so you could see what the vendor actually reported when they sent this information in. Okay. So that's what a cybersecurity label looks like. So you've heard about the US trust mark and the EU CE mark. They're working toward producing this mark that will be effectively a label that you can go to and check to see if the thing is secure. But we're done with that. We're good there, Robert. Okay. Next slide. So here are the lessons learned. So I did the test. Well, I was one of the testers for the RSAA portal to get the bugs worked out. And so here are the things that I learned. So the first thing is the software suppliers need to apply for an RSAA account. This can take a couple of days. and the authenticated app will cost you money. I think the Google one was like $49, but Okta has one, it's like $39. But you need that because they require that authenticator, that nonce, if you will, when you log in order to implement the MFA. Only one artifact's actually required, and it's the attestation form. It's the only thing you have to send. And that attestation form can represent a single product or even a product line. So if I wanted to say Microsoft Office and it includes, Word and Excel and blah, 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 you could do that. And agencies, they are very flexible here. They can do what they want, and they can request additional information. They can say, even though the attestation form doesn't require an SBOM, they can say, I want an SBOM because I'm not passing you until I see what I need to complete my risk assessment. So they can do that. I recommend to all of the software suppliers that they really do need to think about preparing for this. Get all the information you need right up front. Because these guys, you want to get through this as quickly as you can, because you don't want your software or your product being held up because they haven't actually approved it. Because that's your money sitting in their pocket, right? So it's in your own best interest to give them the information they're asking for and to have it available when they ask, so you don't encounter any delays. So I suggest to all the people I talk to, just go ahead and submit everything. Just put it all in there, because you can. The portal will accept SBOMs, VDRs, VRFs, all kinds of other information, because it'll accept other artifacts which provide the missing links that the buyer's guide talks about. So it all comes back around. The buyer's guide is like having the answers to the final exam. That's the way I describe it to people. Get the buyer's guide. You'll know what the final exam looks like, because that's it. Put the information in the portal, and that way, when they go look at the buyer's guide and say, do you have any vendor disclosure reports available? You say, yes, I do, and we've uploaded it already. So that's how you prepare to get through this knot as quickly as possible. They fixed this issue. There was an issue early on. This is a few months ago, where they weren't accepting all the various formats of files, like XML was rejected and JSON was rejected, and that's no longer the case. So as I mentioned, we anticipated having the supply everything, so we just went ahead and gave them everything right up front. That way they can have it. They don't have to waste time asking us for things because they have it. Next. So the concept that I was showing you earlier is that you have this notion of that artifacts, which are things like SBOMs, they need to be attached to an attestation. So the attestation is really the root document that has to be there. And that root document has to be associated with a root record, which is the software record, the product record, okay? So the attestations need to be attached to that software record. The attestations are what you actually associate. That's a term they use. That's how you submit the information to an agency. You associate the attestation with an agency, and in the case of, and anyone can do this, right? You get to see there's oh my God, there's probably 120 agencies listed on one page. They're not even sorted, so you gotta kind of hunt and peck for the darn things. But you can submit it to multiple all at once. You don't have to submit it to each one individually. You can just say, send it to Department of Energy, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, Department of Treasury, SEC. You can do it with all at once. There's still some open questions. And this, I think they're finally coming around on this one. Originally, they were saying that you had to submit an attestation form, and you needed to submit a POAM. I've heard recently they've started to say, well, maybe you only need to submit a POAM if you can't really attest. So that one's still a little bit squishy, but at the very least, you can be sure an attestation form is what they're looking for in order to pass it. The buyer's guide also includes a spreadsheet. And the spreadsheet makes it really easy for a vendor to check if they have covered all the bases. So the way the spreadsheet works is it has 19 questions. They're yes, no questions. Did you do this? Yes, no. If you did it, you're good. It'll skip all the questions that you don't have to worry about. If you didn't, if you answer no, then you got some other questions that you'll need to answer. But the spreadsheet is very effective at getting through the process because it basically lists all the questions you're going to see in the test, the final exam. And then the last item, which I showed you, is the idea of sharing your attestations or sharing your risk assessment evidence in a trust registry. This is really how you can take advantage of the work that others are doing, because other people are doing the risk assessments. And if they have gone through the risk assessment at a detailed enough level, and you trust what they did, then if they declare trust in a product, well, maybe you can trust it as well. It's just like when you go to your neighbor and say, hey, have you ever eaten at that new barbecue joint down the way? Oh yeah, don't go there. Well, that one wouldn't show up in the registry, right? But if they say, man, it's got the best brisket I've ever eaten, bam, we have a winner. And now someone will trust that. And that's the same concept here with this. They'll trust software because someone else said it's trustworthy. Next. Wow, we flew through that, guys. What time is that? Did we actually take an hour? Not quite. Wow, we did all right.
Yeah, about 30 minutes, 35 minutes.
I got a lot more questions when I did this with NASA.
So that trusting your neighbor analogy, essentially, how is the repository vetted so that way I can know my neighbor has some, obviously I've talked to my neighbor a few times. I have a general opinion of what I think of him and how I interpret my interactions with them and what I'll weight their opinion at. Like, how does this registry hold someone to that accountable level? Because I know software submits, I know Linux, I think it was one of the distros, not the distro, but there was one person who was heavily committing to a archiving tool, the XC, I think it was. And he
I was
essentially,
on GitHub.
he submitted, a bad request into it, and the underlying of the whole application, it was only caught by some other researcher digging through the code. But realistically, he was a trusted resource submitting to the repo, and
Yeah.
he was one of the main submitters. So how does this essentially?
Yeah, I know exactly the scenario you're describing. So the way this one works is, and I'm going to refer you to the work at the IETF. That's the SCIT work I was mentioning to you. So the IETF is the Internet Engineering Task Force. They're the people who gave us the internet. They're the ones who define the specs that are used across the internet that makes the internet interoperable, right? So the IETF they're an international standards body, and they are working on this standard, this SCIT standard, which I mentioned earlier. So if you go to Google and just say IETF SCIT, SCITT, you will see right then and there the information about that work group and the work that's underway. But basically, the answer to your question is this: how do I know you're trusted? How do I know I should trust this thing? Right?
Mhm.
Good question.
Yeah.
So the way this is supposed to work is you get a trusted party and it's really a trusted party, someone who's been vetted, that is going to do the risk assessments. And you could be one or more. You don't have to have just one, you can have multiples, right? In fact, you're better off having multiples. That party, which is called the trusted party, right, creates what's called a signed statement. And that signed statement contains information about the artifact that they're attesting to, and some information about that artifact, like a header, if you will. So that information that they're submitting is effectively, in this case, the evidence from their risk assessment. So they send their evidence to the risk assessment. They call it a transparency service in this, and you'll see that in the spec if you look at it. The transparency service operator is the one who is essentially the gatekeeper that makes a decision whether or not that information is A, from a credible party, and B, is trustworthy, and C, is complete. It has to have the complete information from the risk assessment in order for the gatekeeper to say, yep, it's good enough to go into the registry. So that's how that works. And that's in the spec. If you really want to get into the details, it'll show you all that stuff.
How many attestations are currently in the registry?
Very few. Very few. Less than 400. It literally just started. So the government just started collecting the attestations on June 8th.
The buyer's guide isn't available yet, right?
I'm sorry?
The buyer's guide isn't available
The
yet.
buyer's guide isn't, but the attestation form is. So if you want to fill in the attestation form and submit that to the portal, you can do that. Now, many agencies are just getting their sea legs on this. They're not even sure what to do, to be really candid, guys. They're just starting to say, okay, how are we supposed to do this thing that we have to do to verify that these things are trustworthy or secure by design? That's the key word. And candidly, they're just really trying to get their feet under them to knowing what to do. And so right now, the only thing they really know is I get an attestation form. I have to vet the product based on the information in that attestation form. And if I don't have enough information to say, yes, approved, then I need to go back and get whatever I think I need. I'll tell you the one that's not in there that everyone's going to end up asking for, right? There's no information in the attestation form about foreign ownership. It doesn't ask the question, are there any foreign owners or influence in the production or creation of this product? You can be certain they are going to ask that.
Yep.
Foreign ownership, because they have to live with what's called the federal acquisition regulations, which require them to check to see, is this thing a Huawei camera or is it a Huawei device? That can't come in here. That's on the restricted list. So that process of doing those risk assessments is still something that's still very much being formulated. Some of them aren't even expecting to really have their sea legs until September or even October.
So are there third parties that are just specializing in doing these assessments?
So that's an option, actually. When you look at the attestation form, they will accept a FedRAMP, they will accept a certification from a FedRAMP certifier. So if a FedRAMP certifier comes along and says, okay, I have done the work on this party's product, and I'm going to submit on their behalf my attestation saying that they have passed our evaluation. And that can be submitted as well.
The risk assessment sounds like it's up to the assessor what format to use or what. It didn't sound like there's a standardized assessment process. It just has to be
So,
formal.
well, okay, so GSA has put forward a template for the risk assessment.
Okay.
And what they're suggesting is that you get tools that will help you implement the risk assessment. But those are still forthcoming. I mean, we have one, right? Because we've been working with these guys for 3 years on this. But it's still very new. I mean, people, in fact, I'm going to do a demo for the CISA SBOM group in Denver, September 12th. So that they'll see what's possible. And in our case, it's basically a 7-step risk assessment. We start with the software. Give me your software. I want to be able to introspect that thing. I want to see what's in it. I want to see if it has any viruses. I want to see where it came from. I want to know information about the server that actually provided this information. So I'm gonna look for things like an SSL certificate, and I wanna know who owns that certificate. And if it's not someone that appears to be very trustworthy, or it's from or if the certificate is from a CA that is, you know, not well known or not well trusted, we ditch them. So we look at all of those things. We look at vendor information. So we collect information about company financials, company ownership, product ownership, product development. We look at their SDLC process. So all of that stuff is what we put into the risk assessment that we conduct, and then send the evidence of all of that up into the registry where it can be registered as a trusted product. It's a very boring job, guys. I want you to tell you, this is mundane stuff. You know, when people ask me, well, what do you do? I said, well, we're kind of like the lookouts in the bird's nest on the Titanic, you know? We're looking for risk, and we're trying to let people know if there's any risk, right? Because if there's an iceberg out there, well, hell, I'd rather know about it sooner rather than later, right? And so that's the concept. And one of the ones that people aren't even thinking about right now, or very few are thinking about it, are CISA KEVs. If you haven't heard what a CISA KEV is, you probably need to. It's one of the known exploited vulnerabilities. So CISA looks at CVEs, and when they find a CVE that's actually being exploited in the wild, they list it in their KEV catalog. CISA, here's the way I explain. If you see a CVE, it's kind of like getting a weather radio alert that, hey, the storm's in the area. If you get a CISA KEV, it's like telling you there's a tornado on the ground. You better take cover because this thing's coming at you. So a CISA KEV is not to be taken lightly. These things are extremely dangerous. They have a very wide blast radius. Because what they typically do is they'll get and this happened in Denmark, actually, this happened in Japan as well. If you take a product, a single product, like a firewall, for example, and it's a common product used in used at multiple companies. If a CISA KEV is discovered in that firewall, they're going to find that firewall and they're going to exploit those KEVs. And this is why the blast radius can be so broad, because it happened in Denmark, 22 entities in the energy industry were breached because their firewall, and they all use the same firewall, had the same vulnerability. So they were all subject to the same breach. 22 of them got whacked. So CISA KEVs are serious stuff. They're like a tornado on the ground. If you see a CISA KEV, start looking for where you could get whacked.
Some of these I've seen before. If I looked up the list, you got me curious about it.
Yes, CISA KEV catalog is available. It's downloadable, actually. It's in a CSV form.
Yeah, you can also get updates to the minute when they come out. as
That's
well.
correct. Yeah,
We
you're
set
right.
that up
Right on, Robert.
from our company.
Yeah, if you subscribe, you can subscribe to it. In fact, I think I put a link on how to subscribe to it in that, no, maybe I didn't in there. Yeah, I put it somewhere. Yeah, I put a way to subscribe to the KEVs.
We can
You need to
follow
be
up
monitoring
we can
KEVs.
Follow up on that to our comments.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're not watching CISA KEVs, then it's just a matter of time. You're gonna get whacked. Because when these things come out, the hacker community knows about them and they go after them. Because they know they're exploitable and they know they're common and they know that they can do a synchronized attack. Very bad stuff. You can really get hurt by a CISA KEV. Well, guys, I hope you found this useful and interesting. I
absolutely.
tried to make it a little light and entertaining. Not exactly a topic that you typically find comedians on stage presenting, but you know what I mean? But you know, you better find a way to laugh in this business because you know you'll be crying before you know it. Cybersecurity is a tough business.
Online, do we have any questions?
Yeah, I do have a question. That attestation process, I'm not sure if you heard about the European Cybersecurity Resilience Act that in development right now. It's kind of next step after GDPR. They're planning to do like they're planning to do that act. And my question is that attestation portion, they have something similar, where they dividing all of the devices by classes, and it's a portion where it's people doing like a self-assessments, and it's a couple of different classes for more important devices where they do third party and government gonna be included in this. Isn't it looks to you that like CISA trying to do kind of similar stuff in that way, and this way it just only one agency that domestically gonna be like, spending resources to doing that, instead of that we are with our partners from NATO do something like together.
So Robert, that was really muffled. Can you repeat the question?
I just changed the speaker. You want to try it again?
Okay, I'm not sure how much you heard, but
Much better. Thank you, sir.
okay, let me repeat. I'm not sure if you heard about European Resiliency Act.
How many reviewers can you have?
The Cybersecurity Resilience Act. He's
Yes.
asking if you've heard of that.
Okay, so the EU CRA, I think you're talking about the EU CRA?
Yes, I'm talking about that. And my question is, that attestation process kind of similar that Europeans trying to do. Do you think it's kind of we spreading the resources, doing this like separately, domestically, and our allies doing something similar overseas?
Okay, so maybe the way to answer this, I'm not sure I totally understood the question, but I think what you're asking about is how are we dealing with the international situation? Is that really what you're asking?
I'm basically asking the parallels with the UA CRA with that program from CISA. Do you see any parallels?
Between what they're doing and the attestation program, is that essentially, are there parallels between these two?
There are similarities. I'm not a CRA expert, guys, so I'm not going to try to claim that to you here. I know where you can get the CRA language. I know where you need to look. You need to look in the appendix because they just agreed to that in January. Because there was some questions about how to handle open source software. And they there were certain negotiations that went on in how open source vendors would be providing attestations or some level of security that their products were secure. And I seem to recall that the individual open source developers won't have to be subject to CRA, but I think there are the vendors like Red Hat will be. Even though they're open source, because they're selling commercially, they will be subject to CRA requirements. But with regard to the US federal government, every one of them is going to fall under that program. They are all required to submit attestations.
Okay.
So I will say that there are some exclusions that the US government is allowing. For example, they don't hold themselves to the same level of attestation requirement that they hold vendors to. In other words, if the US government creates a software product, they don't have to go through this attestation process. If the US government downloads an open source software product and they use it themselves, they don't have to go through the attestation process. So there are ways around this thing that the US government has built in for their own purposes. But pretty much, if you're a vendor selling commercial software to the government, you should be prepared to go through the process. As far as CRA goes, I'm not an expert, but Robert, I could probably show you. You probably already know where the CRA link is, right?
I think so.
Yeah, it's easy to find.
Yeah, I'll add some of these, but some of these resources as well.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Any other questions from anybody in the room or online?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, Dick, thank you very, very much for presenting to us. Really appreciate the opportunity to hear from you and present this deck and your wealth of information. Really appreciate it.
Oh, I'm glad to do it, Robert. Thank you for the invitation. And if it's okay, I'd like to put a plug in here.
Sure.
So CISA is going to be meeting on June 26th in Burlington, Massachusetts. The critical manufacturing sector is getting together and having a conference. And we'll be talking about supply chain risk management. We'll also be doing a tabletop exercise showing the ICS for ICS incident response program that's based on FEMA. I'll be doing a presentation on the SEC reporting requirements as part of that. You probably heard that the SEC now requires cyber incident reports, a Form 8K. Yeah. I won't go into that here, but if you want to know, come along to the June 26th meeting and I'll happy to share all the details.
And that's free. And
It is.
Dick has that link to it on his LinkedIn, on a LinkedIn post. And so we can also post that as well as a reference. So, all right. Well, thank you again. And thanks everyone. And have a great evening. Appreciate joining us.
Thanks for the invitation, guys. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it. Oh, glad you liked it. Yeah, it's a blistering topic. Everyone